Welcome back to Queerly Natural. I'm Alana.
And I'm Sage. Here at Queerly Natural, we have research-based discussions about sexuality, sex, and gender in nature.
Join us monthly for an episode about a different plant, animal, fungus, or microbe, and learn with us about their lives and how it relates to queer identities in humans.
In a world that tells humans that being queer is wrong, abnormal, and sets us apart from the other life on this planet, we are here to show you the opposite is true.
Based on what nature shows us, being queer is clearly natural. Hi everyone! I'm excited for this episode as I'm Alana and I'm going to be talking about the platypus.
I'm pretty excited for that too. That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah. Charismatic species. Let's go.
We gotta do charismatic ones sometimes.
You gotta have a mix, you know? But the platypus, also known as the duck-billed platypus, but either name is correct actually, because there aren't any other platypuses. So their scientific name is Ornithorhynchus anatinus. Ornithorhynchus anatinus. Yes.
Sorry, that was kind of funny.
I did it twice just to try and make sure it didn't help. Well known for being egg-laying. They're actually one of only 5 modern day, extant, so still alive, species of egg-laying mammals. So let's go. They are in the subclass Monotremata. So they're a monotreme, is what we typically call them. And they're in the family Ornithorhynchidae, which they're the only living member of. So they're unique in their family. And then, of course, their genus and species because, well, there's only ever one species. And if there's no one else in their family, there's no one else in their genus. So, pretty cool.
What is a monotreme?
Basically, they are a group of mammals. And they're the ones that lay eggs. So, monotremes are egg-laying mammals.
Nice.
So Europeans first encountered them in 1797, and then their taxonomic description was by Shaw in the 1700s, or maybe that was 1800s. It might have been a typo. Basically, they were first encountered in 1797, and then a few years later, they were actually described based on specimens that made it to Britain. A lot of our scientific names come from these European scientists, but of course, they were well known by Aboriginal people, I'm sure. Many centuries, if not more, beforehand. But before I get into their description, let's give Sage a chance to try that out. How do you describe a platypus?
All right, yeah, let's go. It's hard to see a lot of them clearly because they're all in the water, but let me find a good one.
Yeah, if you scroll down. So Sage is just looking through some iNaturalist pictures, a few of which will be on our socials, but you can always go onto iNaturalist to look at more.
I'm not sure if we've ever explained what iNaturalist is. It's where we get all our pictures, but basically anyone can take a picture and make a profile and upload to the website, and basically researchers can comb through the pictures and they can be used for research. So if anybody wants to contribute, you can start taking pictures of things you see.
Yeah, plants, animals, fungi, all go on iNaturalist. It can be really useful for scientists. Also a fun way, if you don't know what something is, to take a photo of it and hope someone who knows better will.
Yeah, it's a good time. I found a pretty good one. So these guys, they are relatively big animal. They're brown. Let me see. That guy's pretty far away from the camera, so it's hard to see many of the details. They have a pretty long tail. The tail has fur on it. They have fur all over, all brown. The color's pretty consistent. There's not really any markings or anything. And then they have 4 little feet. They're they don't have very long limbs. The feet are pretty much just attached to their body. It's pretty cute. But their hands and feet are like paddles. I assume they're webbed. I can't see, like I said, I can't see a ton of the details. And then their face, I see they have little ears. I'm trying to find a good one of the face. Overall, pretty cute though. The face, they have a bill, and on top of the bill are 2 little nostrils. The bill's pretty flat, and it's almost bigger than its head. And then it kind of attaches to its head, and then it's got 2 little beady eyes, kind of to the side, but I can see its feet better in this one too. It does have webbed like toes and like pretty long claws coming off. It's hard to guess size without like something to give it scale, but I would say maybe like a couple feet long. So then I think that's all I got.
Nice job.
Thanks.
So to address your first comment, platypuses range, sorry, it's platypuses, I believe, not platypi.
Oh, good to know.
It has to do with like Greek versus like Roman terminology. I don't know. But the length is 38 to 60 centimeters, aka 15 to 24 inches. So you were pretty accurate there.
Nice.
With males being larger. So they're considered sexually dimorphic, meaning that the males and females look different, and that's mostly in their size and weight, with males being about 40% heavier and 15% longer than females. And this is thought to be useful to them to compete for territory, female, and resources. Their lifespan is, in the wild, longest lifespan recorded was like 21 years, with captivity being 25 years, but most are 6 to 15 years old. So once again, we are older than any platypus age.
That's so sad.
Wild.
I should be wiser, but I'm not. They know more than me.
Well, you might be wiser than a platypus.
I don't know. They seem like they know what they're doing.
So they are covered in fur, with an undercoat of dense, short, and fine kinked hairs, and an outer layer of, it's called spatulate-shaped guard hairs. So yeah, it's kind of like a spatula, where it's like flat and rounded on one side and then thinner on the other. So the purpose of their hair, their undercoat, it retains air, so it's insulation from like heat loss when they're diving, because they are semi-aquatic. They use actually countercurrent heat exchange to help, again, keep warm when they're underwater for a long time.
Ooh.
They keep their temperature around 32 degrees Celsius, but they can tolerate temperatures of 0 to 30 degrees Celsius. So 0 being freezing point. So they're not a big fan of cold weather. They're not going to be hanging out in the snow. With that temperature, they like to often burrow when it gets too hot, and they are nocturnal or crepuscular, so they're awake at like evening, dawn, during those times of day when it's a little bit cooler. They do have those webbed feet to help them swim. They have submerged nostrils, and they have skin furrows that are able to open and close to reduce like sight, hearing, and olfaction when they're swimming. So they don't actually rely on their sight or their hearing when they're swimming, or really even their scent. So olfaction is like the ability to smell. So with that, their eyes are relatively small, only about 6 millimeters. And they don't have the same sight abilities as us. We have, cones and rods and double cones. They are mostly dominated by rods. They have the ability to see some reds and blues. And their eyesight, though, is mostly sensitive to movement.
So cones and rods let you see color?
Yeah, it's kind of determining what colors you can see and stuff like that. Their sense of smell, their olfactory, is not actually important for foraging, but it's likely used for mating. So they have these cervical scent glands that produce this like musky odor, which actually change and increase size when mating. But the most important thing for their foraging is actually like their tactile senses. So their bill helps with that tactileness. They're able to kind of sense more with that than they are with their eyes and ears when they're swimming. They have their tail, which has a little bit of fur, but not too much, and acts mostly as fat storage. So it actually contains about 40% of their total body fat, though this does change throughout the season.
Does it change size then, depending on how?
Yeah.
Wow. That's cool.
Like, not insanely, but, it'll probably get thicker and thinner.
Interesting.
So that's your platypus. Platypuses are located on the eastern mainland of Australia, Tasmania, and King Island. There was a small introduced population on Kangaroo Island in southern Australia. There was, fun fact, a platypus species in Argentina only about, 61 to 63 million years ago. So not that long ago.
Not that long ago.
Only 61 to 63 million years ago.
Oh yeah, do you remember that time?
If I think really hard, I might, My memory only tends to go back to about 15 million years ago. I don't know about you.
Yeah, no, that time is kind of fuzzy for me. But no, you're right. Like on the scale, like the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. I should know this. Is that true? Is that the number?
Evolutionary time, that's actually a pretty short amount of time away.
Yeah.
We'll dive a little more into evolutionary time in a couple minutes.
Ooh. I'm excited for that.
So their habitat, where do you find a platypus, is mostly in the river systems and like anywhere from tropical to alpine environments. Their like previous distribution is not well known. It's more so their current distribution. But they tend to burrow between tree roots and are found in, as I said, river systems, in creeks, rivers, shallow lakes, wetlands, riparian margins, even in agricultural, urban, or natural environments. So they're able to like exist in these water areas in a variety of different environment types. But they seem to prefer mid to low river habitats than like the upper river range. Exactly where they're found, their home range, so how far they'll move around, it does vary actually quite a bit based on their age, their sex, and their breeding system. They don't tend to like to travel overland for very long. So they are typically restricted mostly to these waterways.
I don't blame them. Their arms and legs were so tiny, teeny tiny. It cannot be easy to walk. So
yeah, they're short. When they're on land, they tend to be in these earth bank areas with large trees and overhanging vegetation. And they can still be found in degraded habitats. So like areas that have really been destroyed from what they were naturally and changed for like agriculture, for example. So you could have a platypus on a farm just chilling.
Ooh.
And as I said, they do put their burrows between trees, and that's kind of where they typically live. When going for food, they pretty much exclusively eat in the water. And as I said, they don't like to go out of the water for very much. The farthest they've really been reported away from water was in Tasmania, about 250 meters.
That's the farthest anyone has seen them away from water?
Yeah, so only about 820 feet.
That's so funny. So are they considered aquatic or amphibious?
No, I think they're semi-aquatic.
Semi-aquatic? That's weird because I feel like, if that says they're only willing to go that far away. But I guess if they're on the land close to the water, then that would make sense. Because then they're still on the land.
Amphibious is relating to living in or suited to both land and water. But I think they're mostly foraging in water, so I don't think it's quite that.
They're just close to water a lot. They're not in the water as often.
They're in the water to eat. Remember, they like to live right on the bank of the water. So when they're out of the water, they're still very close to it. Yeah, so 250 meters from the water, and then their total range tends to only be like a half to 15 kilometers. Males tend to move around a lot more than females, but lactating females may expand their range just because they need to get more food. So let's talk to the day-to-day life a little bit of the platypus. So they're nocturnal. They may occasionally forage during the day in like winter or during lactation, but pretty much it's nighttime, especially like dusk and dawn.
That's what crepuscular means?
Yeah. Some of them will match their activities to like the moonrise and moonset. So again, still with that crepuscular kind of activity. They're least active in midsummer and most active in midwinter and early spring. This matches with their breeding, mating search, and increased foraging for lactation, which would be late spring, summer, which is like peak activity time. Females typically will stay in the same body of water while males may disperse, especially juveniles, which is thought to be one of the reasons for lower survivorship of male juveniles, is because they're spending more time on land. So when they're going for foraging, they'll be diving in the water, and their heart rate when they're in the water goes from 140 to 230 beats per minute to only 10 to 20 beats per minute, which is wild to me. But they slow down their heart rate, which allows them to dive down for longer periods of time. Their diving will last between 30 to 140 seconds.
Is it just because, like, less oxygen used?
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yep. And so diving is 30 to 140 seconds with around only 10 to 15 seconds on the surface, which this results in about 75 dives per hour. That's a lot of diving.
Wow.
And then they forage for 8 to 16 hours a day. But in the wintertime, they actually can forage for up to 30 hours in one round. So they're working hard.
What?
Yeah, they're hard-working platypuses.
We work full-time 8 hours a day. And that's not even every day.
So while they're diving, they actually store the food in these cheek pouches they have, so they can eat them later with their grinding pads, which they have as alternatives to like what we think of as normal teeth. And when they swim, they use those webbed front limbs, and they actually alternate, so they don't swim with both hands like we think of with like a frog or breaststroke, but they actually alternate.
Aw, doggy paddle.
Yeah. They can go about 0.7 to 3.6 kilometers per hour.
3.6? Is that fast? I can't tell if that's fast or slow.
I feel like for that little dude, it's pretty fast.
Yeah.
I don't know how fast I swim, but I'm also like, I'm not quite 3 platypuses.
Oh, right. Yeah, I feel like, 6 miles an hour is like a jogging pace. So they're like, strolling.
So it's only like a little over 2 miles per hour.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned how like it makes sense they don't spend a lot of time on land with their tiny legs.
Yeah.
Well, it takes about 19 to 27% more energy to walk than most terrestrial animals of similar size. So they're not built for land. They're built to swim.
Yeah, if you look at them, that does make a lot of sense. But I'm so curious about their future because it sounds like a whale sort of situation where like they're kind of like so dependent on water they could go full water. I don't know.
Oh, go like fully aquatic. I don't think they would. I mean, who knows in, another 60 billion years.
Right? I wish I could see it.
They're not in such big bodies of water. I feel like it's probably more beneficial to be able to get out of them and also adapt to land, especially if it's like a creek that could dry up.
Oh, no, that's a good point. Not quite the same as the ocean.
Now I have some other fun facts about just their body, because we tend to think about them being egg-laying as like one of the weirdest things about them, plus the fact they have a bill like a duck, but they're a mammal. But one thing I think I knew this, and then I totally forgot it. They have venom.
I think I did know that too. Isn't it like in their feet or something?
So the males have venom glands on their dorsocaudal surface of the pelvis. So yeah, like back down there.
By their hips?
Yeah.
Interesting.
And then the ducts of those glands lead to hollow spurs on each hind leg. So yeah, it's on their legs. It's thought to be derived from like a sweat gland. So that sweat gland was able to change into like a venom gland. And the gland increases both in size and poison production during breeding season. So it's thought mostly to have a purpose with breeding and territorialness, especially because they have very few predators. So having that also in that location, I feel like, is not the most useful for defense for a predator. But for defending your territory and your females, sure, why not poison your friends?
Right.
Yeah. But it only temporarily paralyzes them.
That's brutal.
The only time a death has been recorded was in captivity. It resulted from like being hit multiple times with spurs.
That makes sense.
However, for us humans, it's really painful and has actually been considered, if you dilute it, to be a nerve blocker and possibly useful for pain treatment, interestingly enough.
Interesting. I feel like if somebody wanted to write like an old-timey like mystery novel or something and they needed, temporary paralyzing thing, like fun fact, they could have just gotten some platypus venom. Use it for nefarious purposes.
There you go. Yeah, let's go with an Australian themed.
Yeah, right.
So females don't have these poison glands, but females that are less than 1 year old still have the spurs.
Oh.
So if you find a really young one, it could have spurs in be male or female, but once they're older, you only see it in male.
Interesting. I was wondering if we could review how they can be mammals while also laying eggs.
I mean, mammals are kind of defined by the hair, and we typically think of these live births.
Right, but aren't the requirements for mammal like hair and milk? That's all you need, right?
It's hair and milk, yes. Yeah, so we think of it as live birth, but it's not required. It's the hair and the lactation, which platypuses do lactate.
I remember being in like an evolution class, and some researcher who way back in the day wanted to question like the philosophy of that categorization was like, well, a coconut could be a mammal.
Oh, we're gonna get into some craziness there. That's coming later. Don't you worry. We had to get through the natural history. I want to talk a little bit about their food, which, again, they store those cheek pouches, which just the concept of cheek pouches in any animal just, like, increases their cuteness by 10%, at least.
Absolutely.
I mean, think of, like, gerbils.
Adorable.
Cheek pouch. They feed exclusively on water because they are actually eating aquatic invertebrates as their only food source. So they're not eating plants and stuff. It's invertebrate.
What would those be? It just means they don't have vertebrae, so it's like insects, right?
It's like insects, it's your arthropods, and also freshwater crayfish. Some of your invertebrates, I can give you the names of them. I did not look up any common names. Some of them just might not have them. But Trichoptera, FMO, I'm not going to even bother. I can't. It's hard for me to even picture most of them without looking them up.
It's fair.
A lot of insects might have like an aquatic phase where they're aquatic when they're young and then come out of the water later.
A lot of insects are like that. Like dragonflies spend like 4/5 of their life as aquatic.
Yeah. And they typically don't go much farther down than like 5 meters. And having like a coarse bottom substrate helps their foraging. So these things, they're not typically very big, but the platypus consumes about 13 to 28% of their body weight for non-breeding. And if it's a lactating female, 90 to 100% of their body weight in food.
Wow.
It's a lot of invertebrates.
That is.
So with that, reproduction. So they're egg laying, but they do lactate, which allows them to be mammals, having that fur and lactation. They are seasonal breeders. And this actually varies a little bit along their range. So those in lower latitudes tend to breed earlier, and there's even up to a 2-month difference in breeding based on where they're found. The thought is this probably aligns with food availability. So for courtship, because courtship is just so interesting in the animal kingdom, they have a little dance they do. And the male holds onto the tail of the female with its bill, and then the female leads through a series of circles and twists and turns on the water surface. And they go through that as their courtship ritual.
Aw, that's cute.
The female lays their eggs in a nest, which they construct. They lay 1 to 3 eggs, which are only incubated for about 10 days. But then the young suckle for about 120 to 140 days. This count is based on captive observations.
Wow, they're only in the eggs for 10 days?
Yeah, pretty short egg time. But then, like, raising them and lactation lasts for quite a while.
Right.
The milk actually contains a special protein called monotreme lactation protein. Very creative, but hey, helpful to remember, which has antimicrobial properties. So it actually, like, helps them survive, besides just being nutrients.
That's cool.
The nest burrows that these females create are actually pretty complex, with multiple openings and tunnels that are about 5 meters long, a nesting chamber, and pugs, which are backfilled chambers with soil. The nesting chamber itself is ovoid shaped, so oval-like. It's not that big. It's about 0.06 meters cubed. And it has a little nest of vegetation, like grass, leaves, bark, so it's nice and comfy cozy. I want to talk a little bit about just how baffling platypuses were to these scientists and how hilarious the issues that arose from this were. You mentioned it briefly. Scientists debated for a while whether or not they could or couldn't lactate or lay eggs. And it came into this debate of evolution versus transformism, this weird semi-religious concern about the boundary between animal types being blurred, because according to these groups, these boundaries of animal groups were set by God, and this meant social classes that were also set by God could be blurred. Oh no, the platypus is destroying our social structure with its existence.
People freaked out.
Yeah, it's wild to me how this platypus in Australia doing its thing could set these people into a religious social crisis.
It makes sense though, because people who base their understanding of the diversity of life in religion understand the different groups and animals as very distinct, unchanging things because they think God created the lion, the whatever. And since the dawn of time when God created the earth as well, that animal has existed entirely unrelated to everything else and unchanging. And they still look the same way that we see them now. But in reality, things are changing all the time. And we came from organisms that looked entirely different from us a long, long time ago. When you view life as something that started billions of years ago with a single cell, and only through changes have we become what we are today. The platypus is kind of evidence of that because it shows that mammals like us came from egg-laying animals, right? It's kind of like the link that ties us together.
Oh, that's a whole nother topic we will get into. Don't you worry.
I'm excited. I love talking about this kind of stuff. I should specify that here we are specifically talking about the religion of many of these Western scientists, which was Christianity.
But the thing is, mostly to me, the fact that, like, it made them concerned about social classes is the wild part. Because, like, to me, as someone who has grown up in a religious family, I've never thought of social classes as God-defined. And I know some people do that, but also I feel like a lot of people do that as a way to be like, this is why I'm rich and you're poor. But yeah, it's just funny to me. But because of this, even though we knew about platypuses in like 1797, I think is when we found out about them, we didn't settle on their monotreme reproduction and scientific acceptance of their ability to lay eggs and all that until 1884. So nearly 100 years to be like, this is okay.
Really? They couldn't just look at one? You can see the egg. It's there for 10 days. I don't get how they argued about it for that long. I'll be so honest. Like, just get one and watch it.
I mean, I don't know how many, like, settlements there were in Australia at that time either to observe them. And, you know, probably people debated whether or not it was really milk or something else or what. I don't know. But yeah, all of that took a long time. I do want to talk briefly about the platypus and humans because, as I mentioned, this is like all European viewpoints. Aboriginal groups hunted platypuses for food as they are rich in polyunsaturated fat. This is especially important when dealing with the cold, so they were a good source of food for that reason. But they also were part of a variety of Aboriginal groups' biocultural and ecological knowledge for a very long time. So I have a quote from one of my sources. It's a bit long, but I wanted to represent this well. So platypuses were part of a Dreamtime story of the platypus from the upper reaches of the Darling River begins with the young duck who disregarded her tribe's warning of Muloka or Waywai. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce that right. The water devil. The duck ventured down the creek far from her tribe, was abducted by Bigoon, a large water rat who took the duck as his wife. The duck eventually escaped and returned to her tribe where she laid 2 eggs, which hatched as platypuses. They had soft fur instead of feathers, 4 webbed feet instead of 2, and spurs on their hind legs, like Bigoon's spear. The duck and her 2 different children were banished by her tribe, choosing to live far away in the mountains where she could hide from her tribe and Bigoon. A second dreaming from the Central Coast in New South Wales begins with the ancestral spirits deciding on totems. The birds, marsupials, and fish each implored the platypus to join their particular family. After consulting the echidna, which is, the only other egg-laying mammal currently alive, the platypus graciously declines, explaining that it shares traits with all groups and wishes to remain friends with all of them rather than belonging to a single group. The platypus commemorates the Great Spirit for making all the animals different and respecting its wisdom. I find that very cute.
Aw, that's so wholesome. I love it.
So they've existed in part of human culture long before the Europeans arrived. After European arrival, by the late 19th century and the early 20th century, they were hunted for sport and for their fur, which eventually led to them being legally protected in all states by 1912. So this is in Australia, with the earliest state ensuring protection by 1892, which also resulted in a stimulated study of their natural history that began in the 1970s. And these interests in their natural history really started to become more apparent in the 1990s and 2000s. I'll say a lot of the research I found was the 2000s publication. And there was a lot of course, increase in interest on studying them with technological advances like microchipping and DNA. which actually resulted in 1978 to 2009. There was its own symposia for people studying the platypus, and they had their own peer-reviewed journals. So talk about charismatic species. They had that many people studying them.
Wow.
So we like to talk about the species, their conservation status, and things that are concerning about these species. They do have declining populations. They were being hunted for sport and fur by the late 1800s. So we don't have a lot of info about what their populations were like before that. And research didn't really start till the 1970s. And that's a huge issue for getting any animal listed as like of conservation concern, threatened, or endangered. And like actually having this information can require a lot of effort and money, especially for these guys, which have low recapture rates. One way scientists like to study animals is capture and release. They catch an animal, mark it, release it, and then try and capture it again. And that can give you ideas about population, survivorship. But in general, scientists have found they're really hard to recapture. So they are listed as endangered in southern Australia, but not elsewhere. They are nearly extinct, though, in southern Australia. So their threats that they face as a population include regulation of river flow. So think of like dams and stuff. The riparian habitat, so like the habitat right around those streams, which is degraded due to clearing of land for agriculture and urbanization. Fragmentation of their streams. Bycatch and fishing gear. When you're fishing for one thing, you tend to pick up a lot more than just that one species, and that's known as bycatch. Diseases. And then predation by invasive foxes and feral dogs. As far as climate change goes, the decrease in precipitation and increase in evapotranspiration, it's all resulting in less waterways for them. It's resulting in the loss of the quality of their habitat, the loss of their food sources, and changing of their breeding rituals. For example, climate change is resulting in a shift in the phytoplankton blooms in the spring, which is thought to be one of the things they're going after, especially during mating season. Scientists think that mating season aligns with food availability. While the fur trade is not really a thing anymore due to these protections, it was still a high impact. To give you an idea, when it came to the fur trade, you needed 50 or more platypus skins to make a single rug or garment, which means they were considered more valuable than any other Australian animal, with about 754 to 2,356 furs sold annually between 1891 and 1899. So this dramatic decrease in the population likely continues to affect the current population today. And the current population compared to like the population that was hunted is anywhere between 10 to 100%. They do have a relatively slow reproductive rate. They have to reach about 1.5 years old to reproduce, and only about half of the females in their population breed each year. When it comes to habitat destruction, they can be sensitive to urbanization because we alter stream flow. Think about it. Agriculture. We are changing the waterways so that we can water our crops. Urbanization, we alter waterways to make way for whatever we're trying to build and to provide fresh water to ourselves. One other big concern is a disease. It's actually a fungal disease, which if we remember back to our frog episode, they're also dealing with a fungal disease known as chytrid. In this case, it's meromycosis, which results in a skin condition, which appeared around 2009. It has been lethal to the platypuses in Tasmania, and is a big concern of it moving to the mainland and possibly killing the platypus populations there. It's believed it starts on their skin, causing like ulcers and such, but moves to their lungs, resulting in a weakened immune system and then death due to a secondary infection. It impacts their ability to move and regulate their temperature. So this is the main disease. The other ones that they can deal with typically are not lethal. I've talked a little bit about their conservation status in Australia. The IUCN, which is kind of like the big international conservation assessment, lists them only as near threatened in 2016, but needing reassessment. Again, it comes back to this lack of information. It's time consuming, it's expensive, and it's hard to study them. So even though they're listed as near threatened, they might be endangered, and it comes back to we don't know enough. There's only really 2 long-term studies, so we're lacking understanding of their population trends. So that was a lot of info just about the platypus. Sage, would you like to learn why they're queer?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
All right, let's shuffle our notes and we'll be right back.
Hello! Thanks for listening to another episode. Alana and I are two queer scientists who do this project independently. So instead of using this middle part for ad space, I like to promote our own work. We love doing this podcast, firstly because it gives us an excuse to meet up on Zoom at least every month, even though we live halfway across the country from each other. The other primary reason we love doing the show is because we want to help queer people relate to the world around them. On one hand, everyone deserves to know they have a place in this world because the world has a place for the intersex whales and the bisexual beetles and the non-binary birds. So, of course, queer humans belong too. On the other hand, we want to help queer people care about nature. How can you properly care for something when you're completely alienated from it? Nature needs more care from people than ever before, now and going forward. If you like the show and want to help us continue doing it, you can contribute to our Patreon or Ko-fi. We also have a new bookshop.org affiliated storefront. Alana and I have added some of our favorite books, and a portion of every purchase goes directly to Queerly Natural. You can also help us grow the audience by spreading the word on social media. We are at Queerly Natural on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The links to our socials, as well as our Patreon, Ko-fi, and the bookshop, are in the description of this episode. And with that, we can get back to the show. Thanks again for listening.
Okay, so the platypus and why they're queer. So it's a little different than our typical queer organisms, but I thought it still would count. So I would like to title this section, How Many Sex Chromosomes is Too Many? So to start off understanding where this is coming from, let's talk a little bit about genes and chromosomes. So our genes are what is kind of considered like the manual for how to build what we are. The chromosomes store a large number of genes. For humans, we have 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs. We have our sex chromosomes, but also what we call our autosomes, which pretty much are the chromosomes that do everything else. They're not specific to sex. So for humans, we have 22 pairs, and we have typically one pair of sex chromosomes. Again, with humans, this can vary slightly with sex chromosomes in instances where there's X or triple X or XXY. For this purpose right now, we're just going to talk about XX or XY. And typically we don't have duplicates, especially in our autosomes. When humans have more than their, 44 autosome chromosomes, that typically most often is fatal. However, in plants and fungi, they love duplicating their chromosomes. They do it all the time. Ferns love it. They'll just have fun and be like, strawberries. They're like, what if I just had like full on extra sets? A lot of the food we eat are more than 2N. But again, when it comes to animals, especially vertebrates, we typically just stick to 2N with no extras. So let's talk about the platypus. So the platypus is 2N with 52 chromosomes. Males have 21 autosomal pairs and 10 unpaired sex chromosomes, 5 X's and 5 Y's. Females, on the other hand, have 21 autosome pairs and 5 paired sex chromosomes, and they're duplicated. So they have 2 copies of each of the 5 X's. So this is already weird because we always think of, this XY system for mammals, and then like birds have their ZW system. So typically there are 2, and depending on whether you have 2 of the same or 2 different is where we get our sex determination, referring to which gametes you make, eggs or sperm. Platypuses, we're like, what if we had, instead of 2, what if we just had 10? I think that's fun. So let's talk a little bit more about this too. When cells divide to form these gametes, in our case is sperm and egg, and also in the case of the platypus, it's known as meiosis. And typically we think about it as the chromosomes line up in the middle of the cell and they pair up. So you have 2 copies of each chromosome. Think of your mom and your dad. Chromosome 1 you've got from your mom. Another chromosome 1 you also got from your dad. And they pair up, and we typically draw them as these like X-like structures as they're connected, and then they're pulled apart. and those are known as paired. In the case of the platypus, for the males, they don't pair. They just form a chain of all 10. And it's XY, 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 all the way down. However, we have not seen a scenario where a platypus would have 4 Ys and 6 Xs, or 2 Xs and 8 Ys. It's always 5 and 5, or 10 with the exact duplication of 2 of each X. Isn't that neat? I think it's neat. And so the way this is done is through a chain, which is sometimes found in plants and insects, but very rare in vertebrates. And it's basically the way they're pulled is alternately. So if you have an X1 and your duplicate X1, they'll each be pulled separately. And that's why also it's like an XY, XY, XY instead of like all your X's and all your Ys. Does that make sense? It's hard to do this like visually, so maybe I'll try and draw something later for our socials so you can kind of visually see how this lines up. The strangeness doesn't just end with like having 5 X's and 5 Y's or 10 X's where they're all duplicated. It gets stranger. So we talked briefly and hinted at this, that the evolution of a mammal from like birds and reptiles, monotremes are like the earliest split off from that after we switched to mammals. And it has been thought for a long time in science that the evolution of the like X and Y and the Z and W set of chromosomes for sexes evolved separately. The platypus, however, puts that into question. So let's talk a little bit about the sex determination in these chromosomes. Mammal lineage diverged about 210 million years ago. You've got your therians, which are known as the wild beast, is the literal translation of that term, which I find hilarious. Which is broken down into your eutherians, which are known as true beasts, or panplacentatalia, so the placental mammals, so they, we have placentas, and the marsupials. And then before that was the monotremes, which are egg-laying, of which only the platypus and 2 echidnas are alive still. And so it was thought this XY and this ZW system evolved differently, but there's evidence in the genes of the platypus that it might not be correct. And this comes down to their sex determination gene. We don't know how sex is determined in platypuses. In humans and a lot of other mammals, we have this gene. It's called the SRY, or the testis determining gene. And it's found on our Y chromosome in mammals. And basically, whether or not you have that gene will help determine what sex you end up being. In birds, they have a gene called the DMRT1 gene, which is on the Z. And it's actually found in humans too, but it's on our autosome, chromosome 9. So we always have 2 copies of it. And so because of that, they were like, oh, these totally didn't evolve together. But the platypus does not have this SRY gene that is found in most mammals. It's not on the Y chromosomes, and it's not found within the system.
Interesting. SRY is the one that makes you male, you said?
Yeah.
So we haven't found what exactly their gene is?
We don't know what the platypus sex determining gene is. They do have the DMRT1 gene. It's on their X5 chromosomes, so their chromosomes are numbered 1 through 5 for X and Y, and they are different. But it's not found on the Y5, which the X5 and the Y5 are believed to be the ancestral pair. So these, like having duplicates of these sex chromosomes, came originally from a single pair, which was believed to be the 5th one, which has the DMRT1 gene, which was, again, the bird, like reptilian gene for sex. Whereas the X1 and Y1 chromosomes are more similar to human mammal chromosomes, but does not contain that SRY gene. And so because of this, we still don't know how their sex is determined, but it shows evidence for the evolution of the XY system from a similar system to the ZW. And it was kind of that missing link in there. It's thought that their multiple X's and Y's were actually from a series of changes in some autosomal, some other chromosomes becoming sex chromosomes. But we don't really fully understand it. There's also another option that it was like the hybridization of two populations that resulted in this, where they separated their chromosomes differently. We don't really know.
I have a question. I get that autosomes code for everything but sex characteristics. Sex chromosomes determine your sex. But since we haven't found exactly what genes cause platypus sex, how do we know that all of them are sex chromosomes? Does that make sense?
Because, yeah, so it's because of, we still know, like, the males have the XYs, and the females have the XXs. So they are still different in the different sexes. We just don't know what gene on them specifically is resulting in that.
Oh, interesting. That's so cool.
Yeah. So there's still a lot to be studied. I was looking at some more recent publications, and they're still trying to figure this out. And I know that was a very jargony section, but I just thought it was really cool that, like, again, we think of things in this XY concept. And then platypuses were like, okay, XY, but what if we just multiplied that by 5? And, like, to me, when I first saw this, I was like, how do you never get, something with different numbers of X's and Y's than 5 and 5? And so, like, to me, this was just a very cool concept to share. Also, just, like, mashing up again, like, things that were thought of in science as, like, okay, these evolved separately. And it was like, what if they didn't? And so that is the platypus, just constantly making us question everything we know. And even though it's not directly related to a queerness in humans, I still think that's pretty queer.
I think it's semi-related because while, there are these big public conversations about transness we're in America, so we are most familiar with the conversations here. But while transness has continued to be politicized and attacked, a lot of transphobes use the argument of, well, you have your biological sex and that's just what you are, and it's determined by the chromosomes you were born with. And it's very black and white thinking, like XX you're a girl, XY you're a boy, and that's unchanging. It's determined before you were born. You have no control over that, and therefore you have to conform to all these social things on top of that have nothing to do with what the chromosomes code for, but whatever. But things like the platypus just highlight that things are not as black and white. Organisms in life can go on successfully and happily and contentedly without it being quite as black and white.
The platypus is non-binary because it has hair and milk like a mammal, but it lays eggs like a bird. Yeah, I think that's where it falls.
I think the tagline for the platypus should just be like, platypuses, makes you question everything.
Yeah, right. But thanks for telling us about the platypus, Alana. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. I honestly, without this podcast, would never have known so much about platypuses. And I'm very happy I do. So thanks, everyone, for listening. Have a great month, I guess. And we'll see you next time. Love who you will, be who you are. And remember, you're queerly natural. Bye.
Queerly Natural was created by Ilana Zeitzer, Sage Roden, and Elizabeth Furman, with music by Migfist20. Visual design for the show is done by Ilana Zeitzer. Editing and production is done by Sage Roden. To get updates about the podcast, follow us at Queerly Natural on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We also upload all of our sources and episode transcripts to our website, queerlynatural.com. If you liked what you heard today and would like to support the show, contributions can be made on Patreon or Ko-fi, or you can spread the word and tell your friends. Thank you so much for listening, and join us every first Wednesday of the month for a new episode. Until next time, stay queer and remember clearly, it's natural.